Hello and welcome. My name is Torbjörn Nordling and I'm an assistant professor in automatic control at the Department of Mechanical Engineering at the National Clinician University in Taiwan. I'm also the general chair of this workshop. The piece of art on my left is called Fire of Beginning, and it was created by Ma Jun in 2015. He hopes that this fire will remind students of their tireless aptitude for knowledge forever. Now, to my right, I have a corrosion experiment that was started in June 2009 and that will run until July 2019. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our honorary chair, Chair Professor Wu, for his welcome address.
It is a pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the National Clinician University in Taiwan. I'm proud that our team, the NCKU Parkinson's Disease Quantifiers, are one of the finalists in the OpenCV AI competition. They are also arranging this workshop. Now let us all learn computer vision and AI using the OD camera together.
Hello and welcome. I'm Ren Wu, PhD student at the Department of Mechanical Engineering of National Clinician University in Taiwan, and your host of the Q&A session of the workshop. It is my honor to introduce Ms. Rama A. Salhi, who is currently a National Clinician Scholar and a clinical lecturer in emergency medicine at the University of Michigan. She received her master's degree in epidemiology from Johns Hopkins University and also health and healthcare research at the University of Michigan. She will present approach to writing a scientific manuscript, preparing your work for a successful submission. This will include how one begins to tackle the order of the writing, as well as tips and tricks for improving the likelihood of acceptance in a scientific journal. The talk will include a worked example to illustrate the process. Let us enjoy the talk together. If you like our channel, please give us a like, and you are welcome to subscribe to our YouTube and Twitch channel.
Hi everyone, my name is Rama Salhi. I'm an emergency physician at the University of Michigan in the United States. I just want to take a brief moment here to thank the organizers of this workshop for inviting me, and thank you all for really being here with me to have a robust conversation. I hope that you'll walk away with some pearls on how to approach a scientific manuscript. I'll say that looking through the program for these workshops, I think you'll notice, as I did, that my background is quite different than the majority of other presenters. And my hope is that through highlighting this, I'll help illustrate the point that writing a manuscript is, in my opinion, more about the approach than it is about the content. To that end, just as a brief introduction to my path to this point, I'll say that I actually did my undergraduate work at the University of Michigan with a major in Arabic studies and microbiology with an added emphasis in discrete math. Towards the end of my undergraduate experience, after graduation, at the end and after graduation, I actually worked in the School of Public Health, which really bridged me to getting my master's degree in epidemiology as well as healthcare disparities at the Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health. After completing this, I went on to the University of Pennsylvania in my pivoting to clinical medicine, where I did a post-baccalaureate. During this time, I got the opportunity to work with a health services research group in emergency medicine out of the University of Pennsylvania, which was really not my first foray into research, but perhaps my most intense foray into my initial intense foray into research. Following this, I completed my medical school training at the Michigan State University College of Human Medicine, and then went on to complete my specialty training in emergency medicine at the University of Michigan, where currently I work as an emergency physician and as a National Clinical Scholar, also at the University of Michigan. As part of this program, I recently completed a master's in health and healthcare research. And my current area of interest in my research focuses on the intersection and impact of system and structures with resultant structural inequities and their impacts on time-sensitive care. So specifically trauma, cardiac arrest, and myocardial infarctions. I like to think of writing a paper the same way as we might approach a large puzzle. Looking at the pieces in the box, we can feel that it may be hard to start, though with some structure, much like you might start with the edges or the corners and work in framing a puzzle, it can be broken down into much more manageable parts. Just to get us all on the same page, so and I think that this is probably information that most, if not all of you know, but I really want to talk about what the anatomy of a manuscript looks like. So it starts with an abstract, whose role is to summarize the work of the remainder of the paper. The introduction, whose function is to really set the framework and the foundational knowledge for the question that was asked and answered in the paper that is presented. The methods, which classically we talk about as needing to be detailed enough for another research to reproduce your work. The results, which provide the information to interpret your outcomes. And the discussion section, which really fits your results, particularly your main results, back into the context of the current literature and discusses their implications. I'll tell you that I find it really helpful to break down how one may read a manuscript, because for those of you who perhaps have not spent a lot of time reading scientific manuscripts, it may surprise you that you don't actually read it start to finish as you would with, for example, a book or a newspaper article. The style that I'm going to present here is the one that I personally often use, but there's certainly many variations to this approach. And you may find one that is different that works better for you, or you may alter this one slightly to better suit your needs. So whenever I approach an article, particularly one where I am not a content expert in it, I will start by reading the abstract, just to make sure that I'm going to find the information that I need in the body of the article. I'll then go on to read the introduction, which serves to provide a foundational understanding of everything that I may need to interpret the remainder of the paper. And this is, again, as I mentioned, often helpful if it's helpful in any context, but is particularly helpful if you're not a content expert in the paper that you're reading, excuse me. I actually, at this point, then go on to the discussion, because in the first paragraph or two of the discussion, the main results will often be summarized, and they will also be contextualized in the current body of literature. If I am not looking for an in-depth analysis or an in-depth content acquisition, I often actually will stop at the discussion section, because I'll find that I've gotten enough information. That being said, if I'm interested in the more nuanced results, this is the point where I would go to the results section. And then certainly if I am wanting a particularly in-depth or critical look at the methods, this is the point where I would go to the methods section. Now I'll pause here and say that truthfully, critical appraisal of literature and thinking about limitations and confounding and any other methodological problems necessitates that you read the methods. But really it depends on your goal at the outset in reading the manuscript. I really like to approach reading papers in this way because, as you'll see here, the way that I write manuscripts is actually just done in the reverse order, and it helps me build it in a systematic way where I ensure that the reader gets all of the information that they need with minimal duplication of work on my part as a researcher. Throughout this talk, I'm going to use an example of a paper that I wrote about 10 years ago now. As I mentioned, I don't actually think that the content is of particular importance to this talk, but I'll say that just so everyone is aware of the work that I'm presenting, the study that we published looked at mortality outcomes in trauma patients that were transported by police as compared to those transported by emergency medical services. So as I mentioned, I often do this in the reverse order. So that sort of follows that we would actually write the methods first. And you can actually write this as you're doing the study or immediately after, as it should follow pretty closely from the work that you've just done. My general suggestions are to write the methods in the order that you did them, and also in the order that they appear in the results section. This will really make the flow the most logical throughout your paper. I will also say that your goal in the methods section is to be precise, but also not to be redundant. In particular, when you're thinking about really complicated methodological studies, it may even be okay where you have a different methods paper where you write all of the details, and in subsequent papers actually just reference that paper with a brief summary in the paper that you're working on. So really think about making the most of your space while being transparent about the work that you did. That being said, every method section you write should include a description of the site and study population, the data collection methods, and your data analysis. Now, this is actually just a snapshot of my method section from my abstract, but you can see here that we talk about the data collection, which was a trauma registry, which we retrospectively analyzed. The study population, which was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, between 2003 and 2007. And a very brief summary of our analytic methods, where we completed an adjusted logistic regression model where we adjusted for injury severity in the patients. The next section that you should work on is your results section. These should flow pretty naturally from your methods section and should be presented, as I mentioned, in the same order that they were described in your methods section. I will say that nothing should be presented here that was not explained in your methods section. Places where people often get in trouble or mixed up is in the results section. It is really our natural inclination whenever we discuss a number or an outcome to follow it with an interpretation. And in the results section, you really should not be doing any interpretation. This is the job of the discussion section. So really in the results section, it is just a report of the findings that you have from your methods. And in particular, when you think about your tables and figures, they should be complementary to, but not redundant of the prose that you've written, which can be really tricky for people to distinguish the fine line between what you may highlight. I will mention here that there may be some exceptions where if something is your primary finding or a particular interest, that you may include it in a table or figure while also restating it in the prose, but in general, it should not be something that you're commonly doing. As an example, this is a line from the prose of my results section where I say that just over 3/4 of the total number of patients sustained gunshot wounds. In the complementary table, we see that I actually present stratified data. So whether you're interested in the group of patients in total or in the stratified percentages, you can find them in different places in the results section. As I mentioned, these are often easiest to build in conjunction with the written portion of the results section and should not be redundant. But there are a few rules to the art of presenting. I'll call it the results section. So rule number 1 is don't clutter. If your figure takes more than a few minutes to glean the primary information from, it's either not the right format or it's too cluttered. So consider, if you're limited on figures, consider another figure type. And if you have the space to create another image, consider separating the information. So here we see really indiscernible data this is actually pulled from a genetics paper. Well, the content of which I actually can't explain to you. But as an example, just separating this out and stratifying provides very obviously much more interpretable trends. Further, make sure the image is of high enough quality that your readers can read it. This often becomes tricky when you are submitting to in the submission phase, because we often don't double check the quality of the images that we're submitting to the journals. But just a note that this is very important, because you have unique information here that hopefully you did not include in the written portion as well. So you want to make sure that it is legible. As an example from my paper, this is one of the figures that I presented. These are the odds of mortality based on transport mechanism, stratified by hospitals. As I reflect on this image in retrospect, things that I really appreciate and would do again is the spacing allows for really minimal clutter of the image. We have the reference line, which is present but not prominent in the image, which I would certainly include again. I would probably make those central point estimate circles larger and probably overlay a trend line just to draw the person's eye in the direction that I intend as an author. Overall, the figure is a good figure, certainly not my best, but I think illustrates some of the points that we're talking about here. Now we move on to our discussion section. This is really the meat of your paper. Spend time here. Writing it at this stage of the writing process, meaning after your methods and results, will prove beneficial for a couple of reasons. First, it will flow really naturally from your results section, and also will serve to anchor the rest of your paper, specifically your introduction and your abstract. As we talked about, a reader is likely to approach a paper by reading the introduction and then the discussion. So if those things are concordant, it really makes the paper flow very nicely. Common pitfalls for people in these discussion sections is overstating conclusions that your results don't support. Alternatively, people sometimes fall into the trap of introducing new terms that were not mentioned elsewhere in the paper. And so writing it at this point also helps you avoid those two pitfalls. When thinking about your conclusion section, this may just be the last paragraph of your discussion section. And in some journal articles, they'll actually have you separate it out as a separate section. Either way, it should be very clear, concise, and also be supported by the other facts that you present in the same way. So this is the conclusion paragraph for the paper that I've presented. It sort of restates the findings that we found in the results section. And the primary conclusion that we draw is that the use of non-medical transport for patients with proximal penetrating trauma may be an adjunct to traditional care. So you see that really this only expounds on the data that we have available and the results that we found. It doesn't go on to extrapolate other modalities of transport or other things that are outside the scope of this work. At this point, you'd likely move on to the introduction. I frankly write my introductions in much the same way every single time. But the goal of this is really to teach your audience and to give them the foundation to understand the remainder of your paper. Every introduction should walk through what the overall problem is, what data exists already, and what has been published in the literature, what are the gaps in the literature, and how your particular question fits into that gap. A well-written introduction will flow really cleanly into the rest of your paper. So going back to our example, the top box here is actually the last line of my introduction section, where we say that we examined the association between the mode of out-of-hospital transport and mortality. And the second box here is the first line of my discussion section that says we identified no association between the mode of transport and overall adjusted mortality for patients with proximal penetrating trauma. I will say, as you can see from this juxtaposition, that is not particularly artistic writing, but really the goal of this is to be clear and concise. So artistic is not necessarily what you were going for. This brings us to our abstract. This is really the summary of your work. And in conjunction with your title, this is where you will either keep or lose your reader. You should keep it concise and appropriate for your intended readership. Now, there may be some circumstances where it fits really nicely and easily to write it at the end of the manuscript. But I will say that just by the nature of many of our academic conferences, many of us will write the abstract first, and then the remainder of the manuscript will follow. This paper that I am presenting here actually was published a year or two prior to us submitting it to the journal, which is pretty typical for scientific manuscripts. But either way, just having some awareness of where it fits into the remainder of your manuscript. To summarize, I think that it is important for us to have a framework of how one reads a manuscript, a way where other readers will be able to get the information that you are intending them to get from your manuscript. Remember that you are building a story of sorts. You really want the reader to leave with the salient points and the most important bits of your research. Often it's easiest to start with your methods and results section, to build the story in your discussion, and then go back to the introduction to give your reader the foundational knowledge they need to understand the primary points of your paper. This is all summarized in the abstract, and that can also be done initially when you are presenting your work in other venues. I will take a moment here to mention that if you are lucky enough to know which journal you are submitting to earlier in the process rather than later, it is important to pull up their author guidelines, because that will help you know how much space you have in terms of word counts, figures, legends, those sorts of things, which can also help you make decisions about where to spend word limits that you feel is are the most important. I wanted to share here a few resources. I really like the BMJ Author Hub. It is really robust. There are a couple of articles here that I drew really heavily on because I thought they lined up really nicely with the way that I tend to write papers. And can serve as a written resource for those who are interested. I'm very happy to take questions now. And for anyone who's interested, here's my contact information. I am more than happy to respond to emails and help in any way that I can. Thanks so much.
Hello, Dr. Salhi. Thank you very much for the great talk. I'm the host of today's Q&A session. We have put the link of our Google Meet in the chat. If any audience want to join us, please feel free to click it. At the same time, let me read the question in the chat for you, Dr. Salhi.
Sure.
So the first question is, thank you very much for the great talk. I always have problems like when should I start the writing? Do you recommend write down all the test result even if it is not useful in the end? Or do you recommend writing down the useful result, but it might take a long time to make it work?
I think so. I like to have an idea going in about what I think is the most important thing, and then I will kind of map out all the steps that I need somebody to understand to get to that point. In terms of when I start writing, I actually will start writing when I start doing the research, because I find it easier to do the methods as I'm in real time completing the methods. And then similarly with the results.
Thank you very much. Another question is, which section you think the most important and which section most of the time take your time the most? It seems we have some connection problem. Yeah, please give us a minute. Let us fix this technical problem.
Sorry about that. And I
No problem. Yeah.
what was the next question? I'm sorry.
The question is about which section take most of your time and which section you think most important.
The section that I spend the most time on almost always is the discussion section. In terms of being most important, that is probably dependent on who you ask and what their goal is. If you, for like general readership, I would say it's the result in the discussion sections are probably the most important. And in particular, the tables and figures in the results section, because a lot of people won't spend the time to read the actual written components of the results section. Certainly, if you have like a colleague who is close in your work, the methodology is a bit more important because they're probably reading it to try to reproduce your work. But by and large, I would say the discussion section, followed by the results in the tables and figures, excuse me, in the results section.
Thank you very much. We have some question from also YouTube. The question is, thank you for your presentation. How to overcome writer's block? This is how to get started when all ideas are spinning in the head, but now text is coming out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is my least favorite part of writing, and happens to me all the time. I will say that the thing that I find easiest is to just write very basic sentences. And when I mean basic, I mean extremely basic, and then just start expounding from there. It is always easier to edit than it is to start writing. So my paper may say something like, I don't know, need to explain population epidemiology of cardiac arrest here. And then like the second line is, it's just really basic of the structure of the paper, and it will just kind of flow naturally from there. So I would say don't be bashful if you think that it is bad. That's fine. No one else is seeing it except for you. You can always go back and edit.
Thank you very much. Next question from the same person. What are the most common reasons for rejection for past manuscripts?
Mm-hmm. In my own work and in the papers that I review for the journals that I'm a reviewer for, I will say that the most common reasons for rejection are twofold. They would be methodology that isn't sound, because really if your methodology raises questions, none of the rest of the work matters, because all of the conclusions that you're drawing are based on shaky methodology. So your reviewers will really be looking closely at your methodology in whatever field you're writing in. And then the second reason for rejection, I will say, is people who largely overstep their conclusions, meaning they have an outcome that then they extrapolate too far. and they make assertions that they don't actually have data to support.
Steve, thank you very much. The next question is so far the last one. So if audience want to ask more questions, please feel free to put in the chat. So the question is, firstly, thank you for giving us a clear idea of from where to start writing a paper. Would you recommend that we start from finding a specific target journal, or just start writing and then find the journal later, which may work better and save time on publishing?
Mm-hmm. I will say that typically in my writing process, the methods and the results will tend to be the same regardless of where you're submitting. By the time I have the results drafted, that's where I'll start to narrow down at least 2 or 3 journals that I think would be good venues. And I actually will write down their author guidelines side by side so that I can see where they differ, just so that I know if I have a revise and resubmit, or if I get rejected and I'm moving to another journal, exactly what is changing in my author guidelines.
Thank you very much. That question is also about how to find the target journal. So what's the approach you most of use to find the target journals?
Mm-hmm. I was taught a trick by one of my mentors many years ago now, where you should look at the journal that you most cited. So if you look in your references, if you are citing those papers, you are in line with their scope of work. And then kind of using that as a foundation, and then looking at sister journals and other sorts of things. But that is how I would start, particularly if you are just getting into a field. I would say that that's a really nice trick that's come in handy for me a lot of times.
Yes, thank you very much. I think this is the end of today's workshop. So we will have another workshop tomorrow at 4 p.m. here. For more information, please check our website. We have also put the link in the chat. Look forward to seeing all of you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Dr. Salhi.
Thank you so much for having me and for asking such great questions. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye. Take care.
Take care.